Um, so yesterday I kept hearing the concept of the idea of India. And I'm very, very uncomfortable with the definitive article the. Incidentally, the definitive article the does not exist in Sanskrit or any other Indian language. You can't say the idea of India in Hindi. Try it. Translate the idea of India in Hindi or Marathi or Gujarati. You won't get it. The closest word that comes is tat, which basically is trying to say, so it is. And there's a definitiveness about it. And it's usually used in very high philosophy, and it leads to all kinds of quarrels. So when we are talking about the idea of India and the shifting idea of India, we are essentially assuming that there is a definite idea of India, and there is a shift to another definite idea of India. But if we were to look at it differently and say there are many ideas of India, and some ideas amplify themselves at different points of time, the same thing looks very different. That there are coexisting ideas, and depending on circumstances, depending on context, a particular idea amplifies itself. And that's an easier way, an easier model to understand India. The moment you say the idea of India, for me as a mythologist, so for those who are not familiar with my work, I write on mythology. And mythology, for most people, has a very old 1950s outdated definition, which is the study of false stories. But the modern definition, the 21st definition of mythology, is basically the study of subjective truth of a people communicated through stories, symbols, and rituals. So anywhere in the world you go, whether you go to America, whether you go to Africa, whether you go to Southeast Asia, whether you go to Australia, India, Pakistan, Arab countries, wherever you go, people will tell stories. They will have choreographed rituals of conduct, and they will have symbols through which they express themselves, art, poetry. All these serve both literally and metaphorically to communicate an idea. And you will be, if you were to see the patterns, we figure out broadly what the pattern is of different countries around the world. So America is, if you were to look at America as an idea, or Europe as an idea, India as an idea, so what is this idea? And in India it becomes especially difficult also because we are closer to India. It's not that it's not the same everywhere. Is you will see multiplicity of ideas. But the one thing which stands out in India, and if you look at ideas and philosophical ideas that emerged in India, so Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, there's one thing in common. They kept saying the world is always changing. The world is continuously changing. You have to sit still and observe it. So they never saw the human being as the agent of change. They saw the human being as an observer of change. And that is a fundamental principle that governs many Indian philosophical schools. Not all, but many. Compare that with the notion of philosophies which continuously talk of either conversion or revolution, where the assumption is the world is a problem and you need to find a solution to convert it. World is chaotic. You need to do something to organize it. World is a problem that you need to solve. So there's a continuous need for transformation. The world is seen as being stagnant or even declining, and you want to change it. So there are two broad ways of looking at the world. One which is continuously trying to change it and is inspiring people not to be static. And another school which says the world is continuously changing, stop, just watch what's going on. And you will figure out what's going on in the world. Now, which is the correct way of looking at the world? If you go towards the more educated people in India, they will say the first one is more appropriate. If you go towards the less educated people in India, they'll say, nee, wait, things will sort themselves out. Older generation will think differently, younger generation will think differently. People who are educated in Europe and America think differently, people who are educated in India think differently. And this is something that we have to understand, because everybody is talking about the idea of India. So for example, I did a Google search in this morning. I went to Google and I searched the word God. And you can do it on your phones yourself, on Google Images. And then I searched Indian God. I didn't say Hindu God. I just said Indian God. And this is the result that I got. So look at this image. Is it going to come? So this is hung, I think. It's not changing over there. Huh? You have a sense of humor. क्या हुआ? नहीं ये कनेक्ट नहीं होगा. नहीं है. रीस्टार्ट करो. नहीं है. हाँ. Yeah. No. Yeah. So you see these two images. When I write the word God, I get a different image. When I write Indian God, I get a very different image. So the universal idea of God, just by changing an adjective, changes dramatically. Google should tell you the truth, no? And why is the idea of God only masculine and old people? No feminine form. White, senior citizen, masculine, and sky, repeated reference to the sky. Look at the other side. Masculine, feminine, animal, plant, sky, water. Of course, if I were to show you the first slide, and if I were to say this is a Hindu slide, then I immediately become right-wing fundamentalist. But what it is showing is that the world does not have a single idea. There are different ways of looking at the same thing. And that is something that we have to be sensitive to. This is a very good exercise. You can do it, just do colors and do Indian colors. You will see something different. You do, and I'm sure it'll work with every other culture. The moment there's a global idea, but the global idea typically will be a Western one. If I were to do Chinese God, I'm wondering what will emerge. Something interesting will emerge. If I were to do African God, what will emerge? But when you say God, something else will emerge. And that's something to think about, because when you think of singularity and one idea, whose idea is the right idea? Your idea or my idea? And that is where subjectivity comes into place. I think we're too obsessed with being objective. I'm terrified of people who want to be objective, because usually they're fascists. And they want their view is always the objective view. Like, have you ever spoken to a bhakt? Whatever he believes is true, and he will give you content that is always true. I think the idea of India currently, if there is one thing which is happening, and you can see it in social media, is that nobody's listening to the other. We have stopped listening. Everybody has a voice, and everybody wants to speak and present an opinion, but nobody is listening. And that's an idea to think about. You see, in many circles that I move in academic circles, this is a traditional model that is followed. The model is that in old cultures, there is polytheism. Then there is religion, which is one God. And then there's modernity, which is atheism. And this is how the teleological process is imagined. The assumption is that we move from many gods to one God to no God. And this is an indicator of progress. Replace the word God with idea. and something else will emerge. Atheism will become nihilism. Monotheism will become fascism. Polytheism will become liberalism. And the journey will be backward. And then you have to ask yourself, where do you think India should be? Move towards atheism or move towards liberalism? And if you just look at this one thing and ask yourself, when there is a debate, and it's a word which in Sanskrit is vivad, one is trying to triumph over the other. And that is what happens. That's where drama comes from. That's what the Arnab show is all about. You know, it is a rooster fight. In the old days, in tribal communities, in rural communities, you would find roosters fighting each other, rams fighting each other. In most sophisticated societies, you had gladiator games and jousts, where people would fight and one will emerge the winner. Today, that is what a televised debate is all about. You have, of course, they're non-violent, they don't hit each other. Sometimes they do, but they're violent and they use words, languages, metaphors, which are mean, cruel, vicious. And you saw an illustration of that yesterday evening. Extremely unkind words spoken that made us laugh and smile and clap. Because we love someone getting a punch on the face. It's so funny. Especially if it is done intellectually without violence. So mental violence is appropriate social conduct, so long as it doesn't involve physical violence. Because sticks and stones can break my bones, but your words, honestly, they do hurt me. And that is what is happening in the world today, because we are going towards this, we are assuming there is one solution for everyone and everything. There has to be one God, but nobody will clarify whether God is masculine or feminine, old or young, fair or dark, rich or poor. But the moment I say there are many gods, I can make my own choice. And if you respect my choice, then you can have a puja room where every family member has different deities. So polytheism, which we frown upon, is really no different from liberalism that we admire. But we don't think like that. Because making space for many ideas requires a lot of effort. Your brain has to expand because you have to accommodate your idea with the other person's idea and maybe work towards a third idea. If there are 3 people in a room, 4 people in a room, it gets far more complex. And India is a diverse country. It is an extremely complicated country. And anyone who believes that one solution will solve all our problems is really not a very intelligent man or woman. And there's something that we have to keep in mind. So when somebody imagines one idea of India, they're really not scientific. They're poets with a control freak trait because they believe their imagination is true. So what works for an extremely affluent man may not work for an extremely poor man. If you're below the poverty line, your aspirations are very different from someone who has lived abroad, educated abroad, and has decided to come to India to save the poor people. The understanding and aspiration of people, when you read books, one of my favorite books is, I think it's called The Economics of the Poor. But it talks about when you started asking people, what do you do with money, people below the poverty line, and they were surprised in India, for example, you see that in Bombay, you see it very stark. You will see slums with dish TV. And everybody will say, but they have slums, they have no home. Shouldn't they be using money for buying a better house, better food, education? But that's the assumptions of the rich. They want to use their television to enjoy that few 1 minute of life when they're getting to see a soap opera with rich people doing silly things. And maybe the Arnab show. their aspiration, we have decided, is not appropriate. Because we have decided what is rationally appropriate for a poor man. His desire we shall define. We become the arbiter. And this is the danger when we don't listen to people. It happens in relationships too. I am very scared of people who want to save poor people. Extremely terrified. Because the moment I hear this, I said, this is a dangerous man. And we have evidence on television, right? People who want to save poor people. Because it's a very clever strategy. It gets you the votes. It gets you the power. You promise everything. But once you become powerful, you don't need to listen to the poor anymore. Then you can do whatever you want. And that has become the politics of patronage in our country. It's a fabulous idea because the government in power wants to save the poor. The opposition wants to save the poor. You see that in the parliament. Everybody wants to save the poor. But no, poor is not actually getting served in the process. Because the moment I want to save you, rather than enable you, the story is very different. Enable you in your terms, not in my terms. The conversation becomes extremely difficult. It is like men who want to save women. And I'm like, no, women can save themselves. They have agency, you just have to enable it. You have to work towards enabling their own capability. They can manage on their own. No, they can't. I will take care of you. That patronizing attitude, which is a very clever and subtle way of acquiring power in a democratic process. So if you ask the judiciary, they will say, we are working for the poor in India. If you ask the bureaucracy, they'll say, we are working for the poor in India. You talk to the politician, he will say, we are making poor for India. You talk to entrepreneurs, they're saying, we are creating opportunities for the poor in India. Really? You talk to an app developer in Bangalore, and they'll say, I'm trying to create opportunities for the poor. And I'm like, really? I said, how much are you selling it for? $7 billion. And I'm like, who's going to get that money? Where are you going to park the money? Where's your company? Some of the biggest companies in India, internationally, observe where their money goes. They all want to save the poor and save the world, but if you see the audit trail of their finances, it's always to not in the market where the wealth is originated. So they may make money out of India, but the money will be taken to Ireland or to another place which is a tax haven. But they all want to save the poor. And that's a dangerous idea because you saying it is very different from doing it. And that's something that we have to think about because saving the poor as an idea is being, and I can repeatedly, examples after examples, where you'll see the savior complex, which keeps coming in. And the savior will always say, my way is the right way. So the Congress will say, my way is the right way. The BJP will say, my way is the right way. The CPM will say, my way is the right way. I had an opportunity to meet a Congress leader, and I said, what are you doing? We want to save the country. I said, so long as you are in power, right? And he said, but that's natural, right? Without us being in power, how can the country be saved? And that's the answer. You suddenly realize what's going on. And the question is of, do we have a churn or a tug of war? A churn or a tug of war. This is an image from Hindu mythology which talks about the churning of the ocean of milk. What is the churning of the ocean of milk? There are two forces at work. The force and the counterforce. So the force and the counterforce don't talk to each other. They hate each other. But they're made to churn. Now, this image, does it look like a churn or does it look like a tug of war? And one has to understand what is the difference between the two. In tug of war, both are pulling simultaneously till one wins or the rope snaps. And that is what an argument or a vivad is, where either my way or your way. Either or. But the moment you say manthan or churn, you are saying that my idea till an expiry point, till a point, then when I stop your idea, then when you stop my idea, and therefore we churn force, counter force, force, counter force, force, counter force. This is what keeps coming. There is a force and counter force. Now look at how people talk. Do they have a tug of war session in the parliament, or is there a churn and a counter churn? A force and a counter force. What is going on in the parliament? It is tug of war because each one believes in one idea, monotheism / fascism. My God is true, your God is false. My idea is true, your idea is false. Churn is, well, both our ideas have merit. Let's use each one of them till we get it just right. Look at husband-wife conversations. Who talks more? Is there a churn or a tug of war? Look at parent-child conversation. Is there a churn or a tug of war? So if there is a shift in the idea of India, it is that we have moved towards a tug of war. We need to move towards a churn, because unless you churn, the milk will not yield butter. You want butter, makhan chahiye, to manthan karna padta hai. And as long as there's a tug of war, which is born of monotheism / fascism, and nihilism we'll just give it up. We'll just keep arguing and nothing will happen. And you have to ask yourself these fundamental questions rather than enjoying rooster fights. So I hope the rest of the day is spent churning with many ideas and appreciating that everybody who speaks brings something of value. And we don't have to check whether he's right or wrong. I always tell people the concept of Judgment Day does not exist in Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism. God is not judge. But there are cultures where God is judge. And there are cultures where there is no God. So take your pick and figure out what you want to be. Thank you.